The app took a major step backwards when I upgraded it, and so now I'm in this like divot where I've got literally nothing to lose, so I'm just upgrading as soon as it appears. So
this is like last week's. Who knows why it shut down the whole the cave collapsed and we died.
The cave collapsed and we died, and then also I got kicked out early and then had to come back in.
Hey guys, I actually looked into that. So apparently Twitter thought it lost Brian's connectivity and shut down because he's the host. I suggested maybe they shouldn't do that when there's a co-host.
Tom, thank you.
Our man on the inside.
Our man on the inside, I was going to say. I
was pretty annoyed when that happened too.
Well, great. Thank you, Tom. That's terrific. Well, and Tom, I'm glad you're here because all right. So I want to say how we got here. I am reading Severo Ornstein's book, Computing in the Middle Ages, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek title. It's like not actually the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages of Computing, A View from the Trenches, 1955 to 1983. And I'm assuming you've not heard of or seen this book, Adam.
Definitely not.
All right, so this book has all of the appearance of being self-published. I'm not even sure when I got it. It's one of these books that I got at some point in time, and somehow was it wasn't one of the ones in the box, but it was the ones kind of dripping around unread. So I picked it up and started reading it. It's looks self-published, but it's better than that. It's actually pretty well written. There are a couple of like idiosyncrasies, though. He spells roll with a circumflex over the O.
He spells what word are you saying?
Roll. Like this is your roll.
Like ROLE, but with a circumflex over the O?
I'm glad. This actually is making me feel relieved that I'm having to explain this 4 times implies that you have not actually seen this.
No.
Yeah, that's new on me too.
And this feels to me like one-upping the New Yorker.
I was going to say this sounds like a New Yorker, totally. Co-op
coordinate.
Kind of exactly. Like I got it. It's not.
Come on, New Yorker, coordinate. Just give it up. Give up the umlaut on coordinate. But no, I get it. I now kind of like, well, now don't give it up now. I mean, now you've done it for so long. But so the circumflex on O, I had not. And the circumflex denotes apparently, I thought it was a dropped S, but apparently it denotes a dropped consonant. So that is like, I guess roll was spelled R-O-L-L-E. Well, thank God he put the circumflex on there to differentiate it from the original French.
In like the 1980s, like when was this distinction so important that it needed to be made?
Or 1680s. So this book was actually written in 2002. But it's good. I mean, it's like I said, it's good. It's well written, which I feel is like it's sent me to the dictionary a couple of times, which I always like. Have you? No, this is not a Scrabble word. You and I both know we can speak honestly here that your vocabulary is primarily centered around Scrabble.
Primarily, but I know other words. Yes,
you know other words. Okay. Badinage. Have you heard that word before?
No.
Badinage, badinage, which is
it's a great Scrabble word, by the way.
Is that a good Scrabble word?
Oh yeah, it's a killer.
Yeah, I guess it is because it's like that could be a whole rack and it's a bunch of consonants.
Exactly, common letters. Yeah, now I'm really up in my game.
Right. Wow. Okay. So this is news you can use then.
Yeah.
So badinage, humorous or witty conversations, like banter. I'm like,
nice.
I like, why? I mean, okay, like I feel like I engage in badinage, and I have not known this word, but like at least I had the excuse of not really being a Scrabble player. I feel you got like less than an excuse on this one.
That's fair. Well, I am very poorly educated, so
but you played a lot of Scrabble, though. That's on the other side of it.
Right, exactly.
So, anyway, good book. And this guy has had a really interesting life, actually. And he's still alive, but he's so he worked on the Link, which I did not know anything. He worked on the TX2. So this is like whirlwind era. This is super old machines, Adam. And so he's working on the TX2 and the Link, which was really kind of I would say, one of the first interactive computers. It feels like. Tom, is that is that speaking fairly?
For the first personal computer, for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what they kind of call it the first personal computer. I hesitate to quite call it a personal computer because the thing is gigantic. I mean, it's like refrigerator
Well,
sized.
not personal in the sense that you would like put it in your living room, but personal in the sense that it was designed to be used by a single individual at one time.
Right. Which they call they kind of alternate calling like real time, and it's certainly interactive. Really interesting machine though, and I just didn't really know much about it. Wes Clark, I didn't know anything about, but really interesting. Kind of the architect of that, fascinating guy. He died in 2016, but and so he goes kind of all over the place. I mean, he is at the link, and then he kind of does some other stuff, and then he ends up working at BBN on this bid for the ARPANET. So he ends up building he works on the first team building the IMP, the interface message processor. And it actually, Tom, do you know him, or is?
No, the name kind of rings a bell, but I don't know him.
And he's a bit. I mean, he's kind of like a generation and a half, maybe. But someone you may have had overlap with. But so the thing that kind of latched onto that I thought was interesting was he he has his. And do you mind if I just read aloud?
You should read that aloud.
Yeah.
It's a great quote.
All right. So before I leave the ARPANET and its offspring, the internet, I feel obliged to comment on what has happened in recent years to his paternity, as its importance has become obvious to everyone, even to me. So-called fathers, in quotes, have been cropping up all over the place. It's the same old story of the press identifying and celebrating certain individuals as the father of the internet, whereas in truth, the thing came about as a result of the convergence of numerous technical developments and the ideas and energies of a large number of individuals. Although some people were obviously more central and influential than others, trying to point out any one person or a few individuals as responsible for either the end result or the vision is absurd. Nonetheless, regrettably, a number of former colleagues, apparently you know who you are, have allowed themselves to be singled out and celebrated as particularly important figures, whereas others, probably even more central, who are by nature more reticent, having received far less attention. And so I'm like, wait a minute, who's he talking about? He's clearly got someone in mind. Tom, I think there's an echo. So he clearly has got someone very explicitly in mind. And I wondered if he had in mind, and this is where, and Adam, I did tell you I was going to tell you my Don Knuth story.
Yes.
And Dan, you're going to have to forgive me to repeat because Dan actually just heard this one recently as he was out here in California. I wondered if it was the same Internet Pioneer, putative father of the internet that I had run into. And I ran into this person at one of these, banquets with kind of various muckety mucks. Actually, Bridget was there with me. And
was this like an ACM thing?
Yeah, it was a computer history thing. And God only knows why whoever made the mistake of inviting me. Actually, I think that, this was through, I want to say Bobby Johnston, who I think you also know Bobby, right? Adam from Facebook. Yeah. And Bobby's been associated with the Computer History Museum. They had asked him to join either I think it was like their youth advisory board, even though Bobby and I were both, I think, in our late 30s at the time. But Bobby's great. And I think he'd gotten us, we went to this banquet with a bunch of Corbato was there, which was great, accepting an award about Project Mac, which was really interesting. But among the people that are there are Don Knuth. And I'm like, oh my God, it's Don Knuth. And I had never met Knuth, and Bridget was actually encouraging me. It's like, you should go up and talk to him, because in particular, what I wanted to talk with him about is I have a copy of Don Knuth's senior thesis from his undergraduate, from Case. And did you know this, Adam?
No, and I can defer, but I want to know, how you got that and who's attic you ransacked.
Listen, no one as far as you know. Listen, it's all. I was just on. I went through this period where, and I know, Tom, you've gone through similar kind of phases where I became concerned that that history was being literally lost. That there was like manuals that were documentation was being destroyed, that we didn't have a way of recreating. This is kind of before we kind of scanned everything. Now I'm actually less concerned about that, and there's lots of great stuff in archives and so on. So, but I went through this period in the late '90s, early 2000s, where I was concerned about this. So I was looking for used books just to buy like old manuals, in part just because they're, I know Tom also collects old manuals. They're really fun. And you also feel like you're preserving important history. And in doing that, I just ran across this copy on Abe Books of Don Knuth's senior thesis. And I'm like, well, Jesus, I'm definitely buying this. And it is like mimeographed, but stamped from Case. And this is on SOAP 3, which was an optimizing assembler for the 650. So the 650 is a drum-based machine. Super early computer. And do you know anything about these optimizing assemblers, Adam?
No, not at all.
Oh, these are amazing. So the drum-based machines have what's called 1+1 addressing, where every instruction has the address. Every instruction has basically a branch always. Every instruction has the address of the next instruction to execute. And the reason you do that is because then you have an optimizing assembler which figures out how long each instruction is going to take to execute and makes sure that it organizes the drum such that when you go to execute that instruction, oh, lo and behold, it's the one that's going to be coming around the mountain here. And the story of Mel, the last real programmer, for those who have read it, right, on the Libroscope, the LGP35 is a drum-based machine. If that rings any bells. So anyway, I've got this. And Knuth talks about this in his selected papers on computer science. He talks about his work on this on optimizing assembler. So I'm actually also just like curious about like how many copies of this thing are there? I mean, not from a value perspective, but more just like I don't know. It just doesn't feel like there's that many copies, but I mean, this guy's obviously going to know. So
do you lead with that? Be like,
yes, of course. Oh, I feel, and I
feels very like Chris Farley. Hey, remember when you wrote your thesis?
Oh,
that was awesome.
No, exactly. Do you remember John Beck telling us about meeting Steve Young?
No.
So similar kind of story. A friend of ours who was in an airport, if you'll forgive a tangent on tangent, and like Steve Young is like waiting in baggage claim, and this is in San Francisco. So there is like a Steve Young, certainly not the greatest quarterback to play the game because I'm from Denver, but awfully good, awfully good, up there. I mean, they're definitely out there. So there's this like 30-foot radius of a no man's land around Steve Young because everyone like is afraid to approach him and no one wants to waste his time, whatever. And everyone's trying to be respectful of the fact that this is just a celebrity trying to get his bags. And a similar situation in that Peggy, John's wife, was like, "You gotta come on! Like, you're a huge Steve Young fan. Like, you gotta go say something." And so I don't know if you recall. Do you recall what he said to him? He said,
No.
weren't you in? I guess he had like a cameo in Superboy or something, or like the Adventures of Young Super. He had some cameo in some like super obscure thing that only a ridiculous super fan would know. He's like, "Do I recognize you from the Adventures of Superboy?" And Steve Young started laughing, and it was a good killer,
Perfect.
right?
Yeah.
Perfect. And then all of a sudden, they're old friends, and it's the highlight of John's life. Okay, so taking a page from this book, I am going to go. This is my Steve Young moment with Don Knuth. I am very excited, but I'm also want to be very respectful of, and I gotta say, Don Knuth. I'm not exaggerating. He's wearing like wizard's robes, I think.
I choose to believe that.
Yeah, let's choose to believe that for the moment. I don't think I'm that far off. I mean, he definitely has got like a wizard like getup that he's wearing, and I mean appropriately. Like if we've got a modern Merlin, it's him. All right, so I'm like, hey, Professor Knuth, I have a copy of your undergraduate thesis from Case, and he looks at me kind of wide-eyed. He says, how do you have a copy of that? And I explained how I got it. And I'm like, and I really enjoyed it. And I start to, asking him questions about the 650 and SOAP 3, this program he'd written, this symbolic optimizing assembler program with SOAP. And the highlight of my life is happening right now. Don Knuth is clearly taken with my interest in SOAP 3 and is beginning to tell me stories about the 650 at Case in whatever it is, 1957 or whatever. And I'm like, my life is a dream right now, right? He gets like a paragraph in, no more than he gets, maybe 15 seconds into the highlight of my life, when into this conversation crash lands Bob Kahn. Do you know what Bob Kahn is, Adam?
I do, now that I've done a little research on some of his other shenanigans.
Right. Bob Kahn shared the Turing Award with Vint Cerf, and it is like I am literally not there. Without exaggeration, crash lands into the conversation. He's like, "Hey, Don, how you doing, Don?" And you could just see Knuth recoil. I mean, if you have any mirror neurons whatsoever, you'd be thinking to yourself, this person was engaged in a much more interesting conversation than I'm about to inflict upon him. He just looks so uncomfortable. He's like, "Well, how's it going? How's it going?" And then, and I won't disclose exact details because they're definitely, he asks him how, kind of a casual, how's it going? Knuth replies by disclosing an awkward health detail. And I'm like, what do I do? Like, what's going on right now? Like, I don't even know what the protocol is. But then it's kind of clear to me that he's being very awkward about the way he lays this out there. And I'm thinking to myself, this is like a self-defense mechanism. This guy is like, I'm going to lay out this awkward personal detail to make you go away.
I'm just going to poison pill this conversation.
I'm going to poison pill. That's exactly what it is. I'm going to poison pill this conversation. And Bob Kahn just does not see the stop sign at all and just drives right over it. And then Don Knuth runs away. I mean, like 180s and just hightails it. And I'm like, what the fuck just happened? I was having the best moment of my life was reaching its apex. And now I'm sitting here and Kahn is now staring awkwardly at me. And he looks down and reads my name tag, which reveals that I'm like nobody.
that's your title on it.
That's my title.
Nobody
actually,
in particular.
They actually give you a different color badge if you're nobody. So I'm wearing the nobody colored badge, and then he's like shrugs and walks off.
Mission accomplished, Bob.
Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. I ruined this nobody's life. I'm done. And I'm like, what the fuck just happened? What the fuck just happened? So when I'm reading this passage, I'm like, wait a minute. I know an internet pioneer who I don't know that much about him, but I know he crash landed into that conversation. I didn't like it very much. And sure enough, he is actually talking, I think, about several people, but I think he is definitely talking about Bob Kahn among them. I think that his view is that Bob Kahn and Larry Roberts and a couple of these other folks, to a degree, but lesser degree, Vint Cerf, I think his knock on them, which I think is kind of interesting, is not that these guys weren't essential or didn't do a lot of work, but that they are allowing themselves to be singled out, which I thought was an interesting way of phrasing it.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point in your tweet, like something that we've seen, right? On both sides of it, both, folks stepping into the spotlight and other folks allowing them or stepping out of it.
Yes. And I feel we've definitely seen this. And I think it's part of the reason why it's incumbent upon those, first of all, I really love the way he phrased this about, there are a lot of factors that go into a technology being important. And there are often a lot of people, there are a lot of factors outside of those people, and you really can't, it's irresponsible for single individuals to claim responsibility. But Adam, you're making a very good point about the other problem is that when someone claims the spotlight, other people will recoil because they're introverted or whatever when they shouldn't. And then you end up with this like, well, now we got a situation where it kind of sucks, honestly, because it's unfortunate. I don't know.
And so, did you read this oral history with Bob Taylor from the Computer History Museum?
Yeah, I thought that. Yeah, what, did you read that?
Yeah, well, at least I read I think the part about Bob Kahn. Can I read a little excerpt from
please.
it? Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
And there were probably 3 or 4 other chaps who were a member of Frank Hertz's team, the most junior of which was Robert Kahn, Bob Kahn. Bob Kahn was a theoretician. The rest of the people were fundamentally systems people, and this was a systems problem. The systems design was called for, and the system had to be designed and built. So in system design meetings, Kahn would be in attendance, and he would ask question after question because he didn't understand what the rest of them were talking about much of the time. It wasn't his background. And they finally said, look, you're slowing us down, just back off and we'll take care of it. Now, the reason I mention this is because a few years later, Kahn claimed, and he has claimed ever since, that he was responsible for the system design of ARPANET. Gorgeous.
Yeah, and I think it gets like, I feel like it gets a little bit of the kind of the practitioner versus academic. It does feel like the folks that were more systems minded were being, I don't know, undermined or kind of forgotten. I don't know. So Tom, you're obviously a lot closer to all of this than we were. I mean, what do you make of all of it? Tom is phoning Bob Kahn from another.
Brian, while Tom is doing his thing, I have my own little Don Knuth story that I forgot to tell you in your car last week. But a few years ago, I was at dinner in a restaurant in New York City, and I thought I saw Don Knuth eating dinner. And so I go up to this guy and I, say, excuse me, sir, I'm very sorry to bother you, but are you by chance Professor Knuth? And the guy turns to me, he's like, no, I'm his brother. And it turned out, except the guy he was just pulling a prank on me. He had no relationship whatsoever. He's just a random guy. So.
That's pretty great.
Am I back yet?
You're back. Yeah. Hey, Tom. How are you?
Weird things on my phone. Yeah. Anyways, I didn't meet Surf or Kahn till late '80s, '90s, or whatever. But then it seemed like Bob Kahn was far less of the technical guy than the other guys. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that again, I'm not trying to undermine whatever. I think his contributions, I'm sure, are important. I think that the thing I take issue with is like it's your responsibility if the spotlight happens to shine on you because people want an interview or what have you. I really do think it's your responsibility to pull other people in. And it's your responsibility to like actually make sure that anyone who's talking to you knows, hey, this was a team effort and there were a bunch of people involved and it definitely was not just me by a long shot.
I can tell you from personal experience that it can be tiring when somebody decides to put you in the spotlight over and over and over again. You kind of get tired of saying the whole story.
So Tom, elaborate on that. Because obviously you've been in the spotlight a bunch for a bunch.
Yeah,
of
well, I've
things.
been the founder of several companies, right? And so the marketing people are always trying to play me up as, oh, the father of whatever you've heard of that's cool recently. Yeah. And sure, I was involved with a lot of cool stuff, but so were other people.
Well, and I got to say, Tom, so so often in one's life, you kind of have these people that we make up to be kind of larger than life, and they often can't live up to that. And it was, you and I obviously didn't meet until like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I had always kind of known of you, and it was such a joy to meet someone who, I feel like you've always had boots right on ground, and I've always been, I have always had just an earnest enthusiasm for the domain. And I think that, you're someone who I know that I'm sure you've gotten very tired of the spotlight, but you've done very well by the spotlight.
Well, it's a balance too, because I'm an old fart. I'm trying to stake my claim in history as well. So I
There you
put
go.
myself out there, but I try not to be too egregious.
I think it's fair to say that you're not too egregious. I think for whatever it's worth, you can. But and I thought that was, it reminded me of reading Steve Jobs' The Next Big Thing, talking about how, Sun just by its nature was, although far from perfect. I know that, certainly our thinking was that you were always onto something big when Bill Joy arrived to claim some degree of credit for it. I know you hold Bill in very high regard, Tom, but I think he also did not hesitate to. Adam, when we kind of think about some of these, because I feel that like the lone inventor almost doesn't exist. I'm just thinking of for the innovations that are most important. I don't think that they've got single inventors really.
Absolutely, and I think even by their nature, they can't have a single inventor, and then it's hard for when someone is claiming credit for things, it's hard for other folks to kind of call them on that. But it's the narrative that people want to tell, right? It's the genius wonderkind that stories want to latch onto. It's simpler, it's more exciting than the daily grind of lots of people involved. Like like Showstopper, the story of Windows NT. As much as Dave Cutler is lionized, it's also clear that like lots of people were involved, as opposed to Steve Jobs, where you'd think that he invented and made every decision on the product.
Totally, and when I was reminded of our discussion last week too, with Les Davis playing such an important role at Cray, but being very much not being in the spotlight. Clearly his name wasn't on the.
Well, the story that popped to my mind when I saw your tweet was Alexander Graham Bell versus Elisha Gray and the whole race for the patent and all the scuttlebutt about did Alexander Graham Bell bribe the patent attorney who was drunk at the time and all this kind of stuff. So,
Tom, I don't feel I know very much about that history.
Yeah, so it's the whole thing with the telephone where the Alexander Graham Bell's patent came in a couple of hours before his rival Elisha Gray, and there's just all kinds of theories that didn't really happen that way, and the patent guy was paid off and all this kind of stuff.
Interesting. Is that and I'm certainly that does kind of have shades of Edison as well. And I have to say, whenever someone is called the Thomas Edison of whatever, I'm often thinking to myself, like, yeah, they probably are the Thomas Edison. They are the ones that are claiming credit for the work of others that are putting themselves forward. They're not. Let's not call them the George Westinghouse, please. Let's make sure we call them the Thomas Edison, not the George Westinghouse.
Yeah, so history is full of that kind of stuff, and these guys were kind of working alone, but trying hard to steal each other's ideas.
Well, and I kind of feel like when you have the situations where you have this like real race or real, it's really confusing because you've got so many disparate groups that are working on something at the same time. Can't you kind of make the argument that like, well, maybe this was going to happen anyway? That this is, in other words, like the role of the individual is even less when you have these kind of rivals racing to that.
Well, the other one kind of like that is the guy who claimed to invent an email. And it's like, well, maybe he did come up with it independently if he was living under a rock the whole time. But he sure
who claimed
that guy's even worse. Yeah. Okay, because all that guy did, so he has some like office that's not far from where I live, and we have some friends who live out in Belmont, Massachusetts, and the way you drive out there from Cambridge, you're always passing his stupid bus. He has this like bus that's his campaign tour bus because he keeps running for the U.S. Senate. And all that guy did was he wrote a program that he called email. Like the name of the program was email. So he's like, yeah, I invented email. And it's like, well, okay, but as a proxy for electronic mail, there's clearly prior art here.
Yeah, you invented email.com. You did not invent. That's
yeah.
Yeah, and and I've also felt that like the people that I have known in my career that have been most prolific and creative, I've also been the ones that have been like least likely to stake their names to things. I mean, they just felt like, you know what I mean? It feels like there's like a sense that when, people that are so adamant about holding on to what they have done, like maybe haven't done very much. I mean, or they're plagued with self-doubt about their ability to do it or what their actual role truly was. I don't know if there's anything to that.
No, I think you're right. I think that the folks who are prolific and are creative don't need to kind of wait around the hoop and celebrate when the ball happens to go in. They
Right.
they know that they'll get lots of other shots, lots of other opportunities. I know we lionize Jeff Bonwick on this space quite a bit, but I think from the slab allocator to ZFS and lots of stuff in between, he was never someone who, I mean, he shared the spotlight and sometimes too generously with folks who had contributed, small amounts or large amounts.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
I was going to say my own feeling is that there's some people like me where I can be the father of XYZ technology, but the technologies don't really go very far without somebody who's parenting them, not just father.
Right.
And
exactly.
So I have immense respect for like these people who stick with an open source project for 10 or 15 years to really mature it, because that's way beyond my focus time.
Well, yeah, and I think you get the history of like Rust is really interesting because there are important individuals in Rust, but it kind of defies it, I think also like that's another one where I feel like Graydon kind of set the tone. Is someone who is not going to make it about himself. Maybe in contrast to some other programming languages. I don't know.
On the other hand, I wanted to ask: are there any famous technologies that do have a sole inventor? Well, for example, when I think about the VI, the text editor, automatically Bill Joy comes to my mind. Like maybe in the beginning he was like the sole person. Are there any technologies that are famous for that?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting in terms of like where are the. I mean, honestly, whenever my brain goes to things, like it's teams that pop into my head, not individuals. Honestly, I mean, incredible individuals that form an amazing team, but yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know, Tom, Adam, what are your answers, or other people?
Well, I think Bill Joy in particular, he was a prodigious coder back at Berkeley, so he was the first guy on an awful lot of stuff, but it was still a big team effort going on overall.
Well, and I think even like someone like Andy Bechtolsheim has got so much energy and is such a talent. I mean, we all know the folks that Andy needed. There were a lot of folks that Andy needed around him to bring this stuff to fruition, and he was a collaborative in that way. Like he didn't try to. So yeah, I don't know. Adam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking, about my personal experience with folks, because obviously, like from the outside, you see folks taking credit or not taking credit, and it's hard to discern. But I think I've been fortunate in my career to mostly see credit where credit was due. Certainly on the things that I worked in and around, and only in rare cases were there sort of these free electrons ready to grab onto some new technology and put themselves at the front of it and claim credit for it. And I think in those cases, the small number of cases, I've been disappointed when the folks who did a lot more weren't more vocal or didn't agitate harder to get the record straight.
Yeah, and you get that kind of get that sense that Ornstein kind of feels that way of like, hey, other folks, you need to like advocate for yourselves a little bit more because you're being railroaded by people who will claim this stuff, which is. I also think interning is. So I'm thinking about it. I mean, I also just think again, and reflecting on my own personal history, but also looking at a lot of other technologies too. I really am a deep believer that when you get a group of people together, something happens that's beyond the sum of the parts, and where at once every individual is critical and load bearing, and yet it's also something beyond the individual. I mean, I really think that we need to be thinking more in terms of teams. I actually think so. Here's a kind of an interesting question to throw out. I think that these distinguished awards, the ACM award, touring awards, or what have you, I don't think that they're a great idea. I actually think that they don't really. I wish there were a different way that we could maybe talk about some of the breakthroughs without lionizing the individuals.
Maybe by focusing more on the individual, I don't know, the individual breakthroughs rather than the person who sits at the top of an ostensibly large pile of those breakthroughs.
Yeah, I would rather talk about the innovation than the individual. I don't think it's necessary to, and I think that and especially now. I mean, I think it was, and I don't know, Tom, what your take is on this. I mean, certainly there were folks early in computing that obviously played foundational roles, and you want to recognize those folks. But I'm finding that every year they announce the Turing Awards, I'm just angry. And that's not good.
I feel
that
like
sucks.
the science world seems to do this quite well. I mean, there's a lot of broken things in the way that science works, but if you look at like a paper about, I don't know, gravitational waves, detecting a collapse of a neutron star or something like that, and it's these people who have these gravitational wave detectors. I mean, those papers have 300 authors on them, and some of it's back scratching, but it's like in physics, great inventions basically haven't been an individual activity for a few hundred years. It's team science, and it's interesting that we brought up Berkeley because that's been like their thing. Like Ernest Lawrence was, we can't really do physics unless we build big teams which include engineers that know how to build these machines to do science.
On the other hand, there's still a fair amount of academic abuse from
I was about to say. I mean,
names to everything.
Yeah, science does this very well. Just ask Rosalind Franklin. But yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of having big teams of folks on. But then, of course, you get into then the order of the authors becomes relevant. And I think
there's pathologies there. Totally agree.
Brian, this conversation, I don't know if you listened to this, but the Computer History Museum inducted Andy Van Dam, a former professor of mine, and I assume of yours as well.
Actually, not of mine, but
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, funnily enough, I never took a course with them.
Yeah, but
someone I know well. Obviously.
Legend. It's a legend of Brown University. Computer graphics was the first to develop hypertext and did lots of work in computer graphics textbooks and education and stuff like that. So on one hand, I hear you on the not lionizing individuals. On the other, Andy is a lion, and he spent the full program kind of talking about all the people who had contributed to all the different things that he had worked on, and someone who aggressively shared credit and has throughout his career kind of tried to help and prop up folks who had contributed positively around him. So.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right, and that struck me too in his oral history that he did, which I think you pointed me to the oral history he did at the Computer History Museum, and I thought it was outstanding. And you're exactly right, actually, that he aggressively, and he reminds me of Ron Minnick does this. I mean, Ron is if you talk to Ron about anything he's done, he will in the next sentence tell you the 3 people that worked on it with him. And I think that speaks so highly of him. And I mean, I think that there's a level at which that is a kind of a greatness where you are, again, you take it as your responsibility to make sure that other people are getting credit for the work that they've done.
And the kind of greatness that everyone wants to work around, right?
Yes.
What do people know about what it was like to work with Steve Jobs? That it sucked, and that,
right.
And that you were a nobody with a nobody badge on. Right, but working with Andy or Ron or some of these other greats, you know that your work is going to be appreciated and shared.
Another person I can think of who has been at least somewhat mythologized is a sole inventor who is very openly given credit to his. Very openly giving credit to both his predecessors and his contemporaries is Dennis Klatt, the inventor of DEC Talk. he so by the way, he died fairly young. As you guys might recall, Deck Talk came out in 1984.
Yeah, Deck Talk was amazing. We should.
Dennis Klatt, yeah, Dennis Klatt died in 1988 at age 50.
Oh man!
But a couple of years before he died, he compiled this collection of milestones in the history of speech synthesis going back to the 1950s, and you can just see all of the shoulders of the giants that he stood on, as well as and of course it wasn't like he presented Deck Talk as the final culmination of everything. He was also showing he also showed other things that were going on at the same time, including research into other methods of speech synthesis other than what he ended up using.
So that's interesting, and it kind of dovetails in with an observation that certainly I have made in the open source communities, and that is like the open hardware communities tend to be really welcoming, actually, and I just noticed that like hardware is so hard that you have to be collaborative and recognizing of the effort that other people have made. I wonder if there's because I mean, Deck Talk. This was primarily this. I mean, this is a hardware device that he developed.
Well, I mean, Deck Talk was, as I understand it, C code running on running on one of the early 32-bit microprocessors. I think the original Deck Talk was using a 68,000 processor. So yeah, it was software, but of course a lot of the earlier researchers in speech synthesis were working on hardware.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, it's kind of interesting to kind of take that lens through history of who are the people that have done a good job, either in his case where lone inventor, but putting himself in historical context, or Adam in this case, like with Andy, someone who has been so generous with making sure that they were kind of uplifting a team, that they attract great people around them. And
now, interestingly, though, Dennis, the Wikipedia article on Dennis Klatt mythologizes him a little bit. It describes him as the pioneer of computerized speech synthesis.
Oh, interesting, huh? But I actually wonder, Adam, you were reading earlier from Bob Taylor's oral history, and I get the sense that, because Tom, did you know Bob Taylor was I guess, the director at Park, kind of the director at Park. I guess it's certainly at Xerox Park, but I gather he was a pretty popular leader there.
Oh yeah, I don't think I ever met him, but people loved. Yeah, he was awesome at recruiting, which is a big reason why Park succeeded, and he had a lot to do with the early internet as well.
Now, maybe you guys have already gone down this road while I was trying to figure out how to rejoin the space on my phone. But since you mentioned Bob Taylor, I wonder if Alan Kay would qualify as one of these people that perhaps get too much credit as a sole inventor.
I mean, certainly someone who does not hesitate to take it. And I think that, and I mean, clearly, like, Kay's had enormous contributions to the field, but I mean, there was I think in that same Bob Taylor interview, if I'm recalling correctly, Adam, he also does talk about, like, put Dynabook in context here. And yes, it's important, but there were a lot of other things happening at the same time.
Yeah, I think the kind of the opposite of Alan Kay is probably Doug Engelbart, who did all this stuff, but really wasn't known for it for many years afterwards.
Oh, I think Doug eventually got his due. I mean, Chapter 2 of Stephen Levy's Insanely Great about the Macintosh was largely about Doug's work.
Huh. And Doug had a brother too, right, Tom? I feel like I just came across his brother. All right, I'm gonna go look this up.
I have a quick question on, and then maybe some context. So a guy like Michael Stonebreaker, who provided us this series of database invention, I think he's an ACM Turing Award winner, obviously did this in the context of teams. And I don't think it's about lionizing people as much as recognizing, the capabilities and potential of teams. And he was a serial entrepreneur as well. What do you guys think about the long term? Like nowadays, if you were to look at any new technology breakthrough, it's all done in massive groups, but you don't think about you still sort of recognize the either company or the individual leader who led the charge. And so I think Stonebreaker's of this mold. He's had multiple successful commercial companies. I think he was one of the Postgres guys. And nowadays, database companies are more always building on the shoulder of giants, but there's still usually some architect or visionary that takes it forward.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I mean, venture capitalists are always looking for the entrepreneur. They get the person who's going to lead the charge, even if everyone knows it's a huge team effort.
And so I guess what's the risk in recognizing those people? Is it to essentially always, as we do as a culture, make it seem like that's an individual's effort as opposed to a team effort?
Yeah, and I I'm not opposed to recognize the individual. I just you just want to make sure, and I think that the people that are actually swinging the hammer and bringing this thing to fruition are recognized as being critical. I mean, it's like Stonebreaker's, obviously great and has had a lot of important contributions, but as you say, has had a lot of people around him bringing these things to fruition. I also think that when these technologies continue to advance, it bothers me a little bit when people leave a technology and then kind of continue to claim credit for its success. I mean, Tom, you're talking about the difference between kind of like paternity and parenting, and I do think that it's I mean, honestly, that is one of the things that had rubbed me the wrong way about Bill Joy, is that I do feel that you can't continue to claim credit for something that you're no longer involved in. You've got to you've got to make sure that you are giving credit to those folks that are actually solving the kind of the thankless problems, the problems that are gritty, that are actually honestly just as hard, oftentimes harder than some of those early problems, but they're a lot less glamorous, and there's a lot of value in solving those problems. So I think
we had a phrase in the early days of Sun, Bill Joy complete. It meant that it would almost compile.
Yeah, and I mean, I also I have a hard time with, and maybe I just suffer from abandonment issues. I have a hard time with people that walk away from things. I have a hard time with, or maybe I'm just a dead end, or maybe this is just my own character flaw. But I am, to me, it's really important to see things all the way through to their total completion. And I think that if you walk away before that completion, it's too easy to dismiss the heavy work that was involved in that, the last 10% that's actually the last 90%.
See, I always had this thing of once I saw there was a huge team of competent people, I was like, wow, this is covered. Why don't I go work on something that no one's
Yeah, that's fair. In terms of, you're like, hey, well, now I've done my job and I've got a bunch of great folks in here, and now it's, yeah, no, I understand that too.
And maybe it's not problematic, as such, to recognize the individual, because that is the story that folks want to tell. That's easy to tell, but it's really important to make sure that individual who you're recognizing is at least in sort of the top one or two or whatever, or three. That you haven't missed the mark completely. And then, I think the individuals who we respect the most, or I respect the most in those, are the ones who then, when the spotlight is on them, take that moment not to further themselves, but to further those teams.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And that's where you really get to the responsibility of that spotlight having fallen upon you, is to make sure that it's being. BCH, I see you getting in here.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's two classes of stories, right? One, back to the Stonebreaker, for example, that's kind of a communications problem, right? Where if you want one guy, if you're talking about VCs or whatever, or publishing a story. You can't have 8 guys to do a communications effort and have it be coherent, but separate from that, it doesn't incentivize necessarily doling out credit, but a lot of the most interesting things that I kind of get into when you're chasing tech stories down is the other credits, and it's kind of like having a good album and seeing, well, who was the drummer on this, and what else did they work on, or who produced this, and what else did they do, and so on and so forth. And so it's good for me as a consumer, but I don't know if that necessarily incentivizes other people to give credit, but it sure is nice to see for sure.
Yeah, I love your drummer metaphor. And so you would really like this book by Ornstein, by the way, because he's very good. I mean, he's very, there's so many characters that kind of come into his life and his experience that he's always, you would enjoy kind of following up on all of them, because I think there's a lot of interesting people that I didn't know about, that was fun to learn about. Yeah.
When we think about giving credit, I was thinking about some examples from our history. We think about dtrace, and we certainly did a lot of work to write a bunch of the code, and there are obviously others involved. But then, like Brendan Gregg wrote this whole toolkit and O'Reilly book on it, and that helped tremendously. Then I think about the folks still working on pieces of it that I certainly haven't been contributing for kind of a while, and really appreciate that folks are still keeping the lights on. And then look at another technology that we worked in around like ZFS, where Jeff Bonwick had this great idea in probably 95, 96, 97, something like that, and Matt Ahrens 20 years later is still working on that technology.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and I think that we'd always felt, I think you and I had felt that Matt is an unassuming person, and it can be kind of happy if other people are stepping into the spotlight. But I know you and I had always felt that like he wasn't getting really his due. And honestly, it's been kind of nice to see in the last 4 and 5 years where I feel like Matt really has been at the epicenter of ZFS, which is where certainly he belongs as far as you and I are concerned.
Absolutely. I mean, again, just the longevity of work that he's put into that project and making it a success and getting on lots of different platforms. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and this is kind of like this is the neat thing about software too, in the ability to have to be working on a single body of software for a very long period of time. I mean, I put great weight on that. I mean, I know it's not, Tom, as you're saying, it's kind of not for everybody, but that also to me is there's something special about that which you don't always see. You often get folks who are kind of one and done on a body of software. So I have, just to give people the 7-minute warning, I have, Adam, I want to make sure we're much more mindful of your evening, largely because I'm afraid of your son.
That's fair. That's fair. You and me both.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So I know I saw, Matt, you were getting in here, other folks that wanted to get in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, because no one's brought it up so far this evening, and I'm surprised by it, The Dream Machine, the book about J.C.R. Licklider. He was kind of weaving, his story kind of weaves through a bunch of the different sort of plots that we've talked about this evening.
Yeah,
it's a fascinating bit.
Yeah, have you read it? I mean, it's on my like literal physical.
Oh my god, it's a fantastic. It's one of the best. It's one of the best technology books I've read in years.
Oh,
yeah,
that's
a delightful book. But one of the things that I think really stuck out about it was like the difference between making teams or building teams, I guess, back in those days, because it was basically just all ARPA money, right? And it wasn't even so much making teams as it almost was kingmaking, right? Because you had that was the budget for technology in the country to a very large extent, right? So whatever projects and budgets flowed out of ARPA really, kind of drove the narrative of where things were going.
Right.
So
interesting.
it's, I wonder if the teams that were successful were kind of self-selected as the ones that kind of got funding, and definitely had leg up from that.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It was a very different way of kind of deciding who and what was successful, right? In terms of you had, based on it's ARPA making those decisions instead of
Yeah.
the market or universities, or I'm not
Yeah.
sure who the kingmakers are today.
And
Or
it was
venture.
really neat. Like if you the story that the book tells essentially starts off with them just having infinity money and just throwing a million things at the wall, and then I can't remember the name that the term that they come up with, but when the Pentagon finally started asking them to actually have some tangible results, I think it was battlefield readiness or something like that was the watchword. And then so all of a sudden, all of the projects kind of pivoted towards that, and everyone was trying to do things like language recognition or computer graphics or any of these things, and just trying to throw a battlefield readiness spin on it, because the money was just so damned important for them.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, especially when you look at some of those the term sheets, like you look at the original deck term sheet, you realize that private financing really was not a viable route. It was, as easy as it is to deride venture capital, I'm very grateful for it. Not only, I mean, it puts meals on all of our tables, but it's been honestly a very important development, is to get us out from underneath a defense money and be able to turn to private money in some regard. Of course, then there's a lot of minuses, but
I think computer science departments really benefited from DARPA or ARPA or whatever it was.
It definitely changes the dynamics of success, right?
Yeah.
It becomes less of a precondition and more of a nice to have.
yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting, like what the funding models, because you do kind of want a hybrid funding models. There are, I mean, I don't know about strict defense funding clearly has its own, and actually, the Ornstein takes us on very head on because the Vietnam War is happening, and he's got very obviously or not obviously, but he's ardently against the war, and he's having very mixed feelings about taking defense money for ARPANET, even though it feels like ARPANET is pretty far removed. So there are clearly some issues there, and then there are some challenges when your funding sources are clearly strictly private and strictly academic. I mean, I feel like all these funding sources have different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, and then you're right. Venture capitalists sort of tacking into the narrative of the hero inventor and the hero entrepreneur. So maybe bending things, or people's willingness to share credit in the thought of getting the next round of funding or starting the next company.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, ultimately, I think what VCs definitely care about is the success of the business. Fortunately, it seems to does seem to trump everything else.
That's absolutely true. But how many times have you heard of someone who was at the front of the marching band, but heard actually it was their number two who did the work,
Totally.
and the number one is getting funded for their second or their third company, but if they don't bring this guy with them, then they're kind of sunk.
Totally. And I think so often and this definitely has happened where, you'll have someone who, like this is a clutch hire. And it's someone that VC will talk to like, okay, like, I guess, sure. Like, really? Yes, really. Trust me. Like, I get it. Like, they're not the person that you're going to necessarily, pitch to an investor, but when it comes time, but pitching to investors and actually swinging the hammer and solving hard problems in the trenches are not the same skill set. And yeah, you have people that are extremely important but deeply underappreciated, just because of the slight personality differences, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Adam, we're gonna get you out of here on time.
How about that? And right on the button.
Right on the button. Yes, hopefully I'm going to claw back some. I'm really. I actually don't know if I'm in more trouble with Josh or Melissa, but just really want to make sure that I get in everybody's good graces.
It's great. These have been great, and I'm all for letting the conversations go as far as they need to go. So.
All right, phew. Well, thanks everybody. Some great book recommendations. I need to get the Dream Machine. I think it's got to climb up the queue here.
It looks like a great one. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone.